Hey everyone, I'm here today to talk for the first time in a long while about history, the story of the French Revolution. I thought I'd share this as part of Historathon 2023, in which I've been basically a non-participant, but I've been following it, and this book fits very nicely into the Q3 time period, which is 1500 to 1820, I think. So this one is going to fall in the end of that period, but definitely within it. If you're not familiar with Historathon 2023, I definitely have not helped that fact since I haven't actually made any videos about history books this year, but basically it's an all-year readathon. I'll link to it in the video description, though. You should definitely check it out if you like reading history books, because there's a lot of people with really a lot of history knowledge reading quite a lot of good stuff there. And it's not too late to join in for the second half of the year if you're interested. Now, I've read a decent number of nonfiction history books over the past few years, many of them focused on 20th century history. And whenever the topic of revolution comes up, it's likely that sooner or later you're going to hear allusions to the French Revolution. However, prior to reading this book, I could tell you almost nothing about the French Revolution. I knew it occurred shortly after the American Revolution and that it was extremely influential on the course of Western and consequently global history, and that at the end of it all, Napoleon ended up in charge, although that wasn't the revolutionaries' original goal, and also that Marie Antoinette and Louis XVI were executed at the guillotine somewhere along the way, along with more than a few others. That's really about it, though, as far as my knowledge goes. When Robespierre was mentioned, that rang a bell too, but I couldn't tell you a whole lot about him other than that he was a leader and perhaps one who was directly involved in the king's execution, which is true. In any case, I was long overdue for an intro to the French Revolution, and after searching around for a while, I finally settled on the book A New World Begins by Jeremy Popkin, which seemed to be pretty well received by readers. Among other complimentary reviews, I saw it suggested on Goodreads that this was one of the more accessible entry points, in spite of also having a lot of depth, which was a good thing for me, but with more focus than normal on introducing the important concepts instead of simply assuming prior knowledge of them. And after reading this, I can pretty much confirm that that is true. After all, I just mentioned to you that I didn't even know who Robespierre was before reading this, and despite my lack of prior knowledge, I was able to follow the book, though it was definitely still a challenge to keep up with the cast of characters, the main events, groups, and the like. Of course, the reader has some benefit here in that once you've heard a character's name multiple times, like 5 times, you start to remember them and get the sense that they're going to be at least somewhat important. But it's always tricky for me keeping track of all those characters in these accounts. So specifically, what time period are we looking at here? He starts with an introduction to Louis XVI and France around the time of his coronation, as well as to some of the new philosophical and political ideas that were brewing at the time, and a debt crisis. I hadn't actually realized that it was a major debt crisis that really made the time ripe for revolution in the late 1780s. The book then focuses in detail on the revolutionary period from 1789 to 1804, but definitely focuses more heavily on the earlier period from 1789 through 1794, up until the death of Robespierre. After that, we get about a fifth of the book, maybe even a little bit less, covering the struggles to establish a stable government of one kind or another from 1794 through 1804, and Napoleon Bonaparte's rise to power during this period. Finally, there's an epilogue, which is honestly only like a few pages, that sweeps through the impact of the French Revolution over the next 2 centuries. Surprisingly, I actually found this epilogue pretty useful for what it was, but I still think it would have been valuable to hear something longer and more developed. Like a whole chapter could have been devoted to this, and I think would have been useful, especially for beginners. This is pretty indicative of the overall style of the book, though. The author typically just presents us the events without too much interpretation. For some people, this is amazing. Personally, however, I wouldn't have minded a bit more analysis. And, some level of interpretation or bias is always inherently present in a work, just by the very nature of which topics the author deems worthy of including. And to the author's credit, it also felt for this reason like quite a balanced account of things. Not particularly judgmental of the actors, and sometimes offering deeper insight into why they held the beliefs they did, really trying to understand their motivations, but at the same time not brushing away the fact that there was a lot of violence and really mayhem that went down, especially during the end of the French Revolution, but arguably the whole time. Though I don't have another point of reference, I'd consider this a pretty moderate take on the French Revolution. The author is sympathetic to revolutionaries and admiring of the better ideas that carried it along, but also cognizant of its failures. I guess if I had to peg the author a little more precisely, I'd say he comes across as viewing the revolutionaries somewhat leniently, as people who were more or less well-intentioned, but were simply trying to take on a task so ambitious that it was rather inevitable it would run amok, rather than reaching its idealistic goals. I mean, he's certainly not citing the revolution as some kind of case against modern day liberal trends or as a push towards more conservative governments or anything like that. The book is told in fairly strict chronological order. As a result, it often felt to me somewhat choppy in terms of ideas, making it tricky to follow the overall train of thought. It's a little bit like one of those fiction books where there are 10 different point of view characters and you hear a little bit about one character and then you don't come back to them for quite a while. Except instead of 10 different characters, we're really jumping back and forth between 10 different, somewhat related topics. My personal preference would have probably been for Popkin instead to group the similar topics more together, even at the cost of them coming out of order some of the time. It did mean, though, that there were a lot of topics that appeared frequently, but that never really came together because I never quite had a chance to synthesize what I'd heard from all the different fragments scattered throughout. In particular, there were these interludes on slave revolts in the colonies that ultimately culminated in the Haitian Revolution, as well as discussions about slavery in the newly created assembly that just never fell into place for me. I think the same could even be said for Popkin's coverage of women's role within the revolution as a group and how they were affected by the revolution. This was interleaved maybe a bit more naturally, but I still think it could have benefited from a more thorough treatment instead of just being mentioned here and there. I'm not talking so much about the roles of individual famous women like Marie Antoinette or Olympe de Gouges or Madame Roland. Since many women are characters in this book in their own rights, I'm referring more though to like a demographic or collective description of women's roles in the revolution and their experiences. Now, to be fair, while some of the topics fit into this category of feeling rather disjointed, there were others that received a comprehensive enough treatment that they stuck in my mind better even when they were kind of broken up. For example, there were many discussions here and there about what happened to the Catholic Church. Confiscation of property, forcing priests to swear an oath of loyalty to basically the new order in France. Usually a fair amount of resistance from church leaders, or at least kind of passively hoping that things would return to the way they used to be. This story came together for me pretty solidly. Or similarly, I appreciated the treatments of France's military campaigns abroad and on its borders, where they happened, which types of French people were recruited or were leaving the military, and the evolving rationale given for these campaigns. The publicly acknowledged reasons for the war shifted over time from a supposed idealism to eventually a more straightforward and maybe honest line that it would make France more powerful to expand its territory and to take advantage of its newly weakened enemies, regardless of whether the people in the conquered regions actually cared to embrace France's revolutionary principles. Because we see that in some regions they did welcome the new form of government, while in other regions they hardly felt liberated. So these more deeply covered through lines were some of the most satisfying and educational parts of the book for me. All said and done, I came out the other end happy now to be able to name a lot of the main players, or at least recognize them, recognize the main events, what was at stake at different points during the revolution. So as an entry point into the topic, I really wasn't a bad one overall. I'm certainly confident that if I now read another book on the French Revolution, I'd have a much better framework with which to follow along, and would have a much easier time. And to that point, after finishing the book, I watched this hour-and-a-half documentary, which I'll link in the video description, which gives a much more condensed account of the French Revolution up to the end of the Great Terror and the fall of Robespierre, and I did find that just about everything in it was familiar to me. It actually might not be a bad idea, though, to watch that first if you're interested in learning about the French Revolution, and then if you want to dive in deeper, you can read the whole book. Because it would have been useful before reading to at least know some of the more important characters to look out for. Necker, Marat, Madame Roland. My point is that these characters probably aren't the ones you've heard of a ton before, and you may not recognize their importance when they're first introduced, so it's good to have a heads up that you should pay attention to them and many others before you get started. Like even watching the crash course European history might not be a bad start. And while I enjoyed that documentary, it really only scratches the surface, and it focuses more on a few main players like Louis XVI and Robespierre, even if sometimes this gives less of a full picture. In Popkin's telling, by contrast, Robespierre was not really like an exceptionally zealous revolutionary, but just one of many like him who in the end would become the man at the top, mostly by chance and by good fortune, or bad fortune, depending on how you see it. Now, we don't get too much of Napoleon in this book. He's more of a final chapter to the book than a story in his own right. For one thing, Napoleon's emperorship and the Napoleonic Wars fall outside of the scope of this book. We do also get a lot of Toussaint Louverture, the spearhead of the Haitian Revolution, but like I said before, this story unfortunately doesn't really feel fully fleshed out in this work to me. I think his story would have been better addressed within an entirely different chapter, if not an entirely distinct book, as is more often the case, but I understand what Popkin is trying to do here by bringing his story in with the rest of the French Revolution. It just didn't really work in the chopped up way that it was presented. In fact, towards the end of the book, there was a section that I found emblematic of Louverture's plight throughout this entire narrative. The author briefly describes some power struggles between Louverture and other officers, before then abruptly cutting to Napoleon Bonaparte's campaigns in Italy and Egypt. If the author had finally managed to pique our interest in the important but less famous Louverture, he quickly undermines this by cutting to the one man famous enough that even grade schoolers in the US have maybe heard of. So I think the Haitian Revolution is actually something I'd really like to return to sometime for its own sake. Looking at what other reviewers had to say, mostly on Goodreads, I saw similar sentiments about the overall presentation. One reviewer pointed out, quote, "Because space is at a premium, Popkin never takes the time to build a scene or deliver a satisfactory narrative set piece." End quote. Indeed, this book covers almost as much historical ground as Orlando Figue's A People's Tragedy, but in roughly 40% as many words. It's not as fun to read or as immersive exactly. It gets the job done, and it gets it done well, and something has to be said for the fact that he chose to tell in 20 hours a story that many would have simply chosen to tell in 30 or even 50 hours. And another reviewer concurred, quote, "While Popkin's book may be somewhat lacking as a work of literature, it is an undeniably solid work of history." End quote. Still, I definitely got a rough overall snapshot of the period. A definite impression of what it would have been like to be swept up in the excitement of this period that quickly turned to violence and ultimately escalated out of control into something self-defeating in a lot of ways before the dust all settled. And I can now pretty confidently say, if you have a time machine and can go check out any time and place in the past, this is one of those times where I'd recommend staying away and just watching the documentaries instead. Or if you do go, just definitely go in, say, before maybe 1791. But then you also might starve, so I guess you just really can't win. One of my favorite parts about reading history books is how you see recurring themes that come back again and again, and you can begin to draw connections between them. And this book was no exception. One of the most prominent recurring themes was this tension that arises in challenging times amongst the more progressive players in the political landscape, between, say, reformists and revolutionaries, both of whom are in some form or another opposing the more conservative side, here the monarchists or the royalists. It's not quite as simple as left and right here, though, because some of these boundaries are constantly shifting, and that was definitely true in the French Revolution. For example, Edmund Burke, considered by many the father of modern conservatism, makes his famous appearance here arguing for moderation rather than revolution, but he wasn't exactly the farthest to the right here. He certainly saw the need for reform, but also the dangers of revolution without restraint. Now, I'm not sure that the highly cautious position he advocated for was really any more tenable or desirable for the struggling folks than what ultimately arose, but I certainly have to admire the foresight and the appeal of this point of view that we do want to change things, but if we get too zealous in changing them, this could really get out of hand. Of course, the counter-argument to Burke's conservative approach is that at a certain point, when attempted reforms are continually undermined or diluted by the entrenched powers, and thus unable to contend with immediate and important issues like debt, crisis, and famine, eventually revolutionary action becomes inevitable. Not because the chaos it brings about is desirable or appealing for most people, but because, at least from the point of view of the people most affected by the existing government's failures, things really couldn't get any worse. Like, if you have to choose between face starvation under the current government or beckon in a new government that is going to put a bunch of people under the guillotine, and possibly even you might take your chance with the guillotine government. So really, in the broad sense here, I'm really more of a reformist myself than a revolutionary on most issues. I think it's really important, though, for government or other leaders to continuously reflect and reform in order to avoid reaching this situation in which there's such disconnect that people feel no other option than to riot in the streets or storm the Bastille. But the important point is this really has to be a continual process. If the existing government only starts trying to force through increasingly huge concessions or reforms at the point when revolution seems pretty much imminent, there's simply not enough time for the system to balance itself out. And then the traditional processes may very well be too slow to avert a more violent eruption of protests. Another recurring theme in modern history that's raised in this book is, can we really force people to adopt liberal values? How do you bring about a government with liberal values? And by liberal values, I'm talking about the kind of stuff you usually see in a constitution. You know, the details differ, but freedom of speech, freedom from religious persecution, the right to a fair trial, the right to participate in the election of rulers, which means that government is only done by the consent of the people. How do you bring about a government with these values when that's not the place you're starting from? And to what extent is a government really justified in curtailing freedoms in order to achieve a goal of long-term freedoms? Do the ends justify the means? For example, during the Terror in France, freedom of the press was limited because there were people publishing pamphlets against the revolution, against the very foundations of the new government. So it makes sense why the revolutionaries would want to stamp out these kinds of ideas, but at the same time, you can't really force liberal values on people and still call it liberalism. At some point, they really have to agree to it. But in one of the closest things that Popkin takes to a stance in this book, he admits briefly, without condoning anyone's actions, that it's certainly possible that within the environment in which the characters found themselves, it was necessary to curtail certain liberties to ensure them in the long run. He, and we as readers, can at the very least understand why it would have seemed to those at the helm like this was absolutely necessary. But then we see where it went and where it's gone on other occasions, and you definitely wonder how often it happens that the short-term revocation of liberties is really as short-term as intended. Maybe there are some examples, though, from history where it has actually helped to establish a liberal government. Definitely let me know if you think of any yourself, because I'd definitely be very curious there, and I'm not a historian myself. Probably should have said that right at the beginning, but since I don't know anything about the French Revolution, that probably also makes it pretty clear. Okay, another common theme that I've seen before in other contexts was sort of this respect of intellectuals for the common people up to the point where it's useful, or where the common people agree with them. After the early days of the revolution were over, it became quite a bit more difficult for me to follow the different interest groups, because on one hand, members of the Third Estate, or that's a fairly wide group, but it included peasant farmers and working class individuals, as well as your more bourgeois non-nobility. These people were seen as kind of the heart and the manpower of the revolution and the driving will behind it. But on the other hand, there was this common predicament for the intellectuals leading the revolution as to how to contain the revolutionary zeal of the masses to keep it from just descending into outright violence and anarchy, which at the times it sort of did for a while. I definitely noticed this theme as well when I was previously reading about the days after the Russian Revolution. Of course, the peasants in particular are always an interesting group because they're so misunderstood. Often they're seen as the heart and soul of the nation by people who have rarely, if ever, even spoken with one of them. So you see this emerging disconnect between those in the cities who advocated for what they thought those in the country or rural areas wanted and what those people actually wanted. For a really demonstrative example, we get this account of a famous event in which Louis XVI tries to escape with his family into exile, expecting the support of the peasants, who traditionally, I think, saw the king as sort of a protector who reigned in their lords. But as soon as Louis XVI is discovered, he finds that the peasants have no respect for him anymore, and they deliver him right back into the hands of the revolutionaries. With all this said, it's hard for me to tell what to make of the French Revolution when looking back on it. On one hand, I feel like it was a horrible disaster, and it's hard to argue against that. And that's how it ended up, and maybe it was even doomed to be that way. But at the same time, there were a lot of reasonable principles behind it, and even a lot of new political and intellectual ideas that came out of it. And it was the foundation of later a real Republican government, even if there were also all these less admirable tools of repression, the first violations of civil liberties that also were born of this revolution. So have you read anything about the French Revolution? I'd love it if you leave a comment with one particularly good book you've read and would recommend on the topic, or a book you would not recommend would also be valuable for many of us too, I think. But aside from that, thanks for watching this review, and I hope it's not too long before I'm talking about some historical nonfiction again. Oh, and check out Historathon 2023 if my basically once a year pace of history reviews isn't going to satisfy your interests, because there are a lot of people there reading and discussing a wide range of books from all the way from prehistoric times to the present. I wanted to make an introduction video at the beginning of the year for this readathon, but I never got around to doing it. But definitely check it out. I will leave a link where you can find out more. Happy reading.